Tonight on Bread Theory, we are going to be pressing on with our series on Permaculture 101, getting you used to the concepts, the theories, and the practice of permaculture. I believe it's a very important theory for any person concerned about the world in any way to familiarize themselves with. Whether you're coming at it from a political organizing angle, whether you just want to do better for yourself and for your neighbors, I think there's a bunch of practical advice and techniques, as well as principles and ethics that can be followed and gained from. So, with that in mind, tonight I have a very special guest, a friend of mine for a while from the permaculture group on Facebook. I've gotten to know his work over the course of the years. He's a phenomenal permaculture designer and teacher and practitioner. Mike Hoag is going to be joining me tonight. So, without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and give him a call, and then we'll get rolling with the videos. And as always, if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask. There's no bad questions, as long as you're acting in good faith, of course. But there's no bad questions. I'm always there to help people learn more and gain more from what I think is one of the most valuable bodies of theory and knowledge that has arisen in the 20th century and now continues on into the 21st, thankfully. So yeah, don't hesitate to ask with any questions you have. If you haven't seen any of the other videos in the series, I highly recommend you check out my my backlog on both Twitch, and then if you can't find it there, you can go to my archives on YouTube, and the Nightbot will be sending out the link to find me in all the various places throughout the night, so you can always click on that, my link tree there, and find out what you've missed, what we've covered so far, if you're feeling like you're a bit lost in where we're at the time. So tonight we've gotten through all the different we've gotten through a big overview of an actual permaculture designer class. We've taken a look at a few of the luminaries within permaculture, the founder, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, and as well as Jeff Lawton and a few more people that are involved in that. And now we're going to move into the techniques, some of the techniques, which it's important to note aren't going to be applicable for every place. Like, for myself, for example, I live in an apartment. I can't really do any sort of earthworks in my apartment. But it's still, for me, important to know in case I ever get a place where I can do these sorts of techniques. But beyond that, they're not going to be applicable to every situation. Permaculture is always situational. You never want to have it be a one-size-fits-all solution. That's the opposite of what permaculture is seeking to be. But enough of that sort of thing. We'll give Mike a call, and then we'll get rolling with the rest of the show. So there we go. Just give him a call now. Volume up. Okay, I'll try and turn the volume up a little.
Hello.
Hello, Mike. Are you there?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I got you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You're coming through. Let me just check the level on you. Could you start by introducing yourself, and I'll get a level on you.
Yeah, sure. I'm Mike Hoag, as I was just introduced there. I've been a permaculture designer now for quite a while. I got into permaculture. Actually, I grew up kind of farming and worked in a lot of different aspects of that field. And at the same time, I was always a community organizer and activist on the side too. So I've worked with the Sierra Club and Pergem and with the Green Party, and so that was always an interest as well. And I don't think I'd still be with the permaculture, which kind of unites those two things and makes the gardening component make a lot more sense to someone like me. So yeah, so that's great. And then it kind of transitioned from a hobby into a full-time career about 10 years ago, and since then it's been fantastic. I've loved it.
Very good, very good. Let's see. Did you mention where you got your permaculture design certificate from?
Yeah, the original one was from Bill Wilson of Midwest Permaculture. Some of my earlier teachers, though, were Rob Scott. I was involved in some of the stuff he was doing in central Illinois around about 20 years ago now. And then I also did one of the Jeff Lawton online ones as just sort of a refresher when those came out. So yeah, so that about covers it for that.
Very cool.
I've also, I should also, mention Peter Baine was a big influence, and I've
Oh
worked
yes.
taught with him too. So
Yeah, one of the foremost permaculture practitioners in this country, in the United States. I have one of his books. I'm blanking on the title right now, but it's really a good one. There's a lot of great ones out there, but his is really good too. Um, so yeah, so are you ready to get into some permaculture techniques tonight?
absolutely, and by the
Awesome.
way, it's the Permaculture Handbook,
Oh,
and
that's the one. Yeah.
it's all about techniques that people can use, especially on the home
Very good.
scale. Great book.
Very good. And I've already given the caveat that just because these are techniques that permaculturists tend to gravitate towards, it doesn't mean it's going to work in every situation. I think that's important to keep in mind. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned the idea of something, but here's the thing: we can always look to have them inspire us, right? Because you
Absolutely.
can an apartment now and not be able to like dig swales in your living room.
Right.
But we can get out there and do guerrilla gardening. And whenever I've lived in an apartment, I've always had a decentralized garden and all around me, and the mile where I can walk to around my house, that's my garden.
Very
And
cool.
we can do things like dig swales in those areas. So we can always let these things inspire us.
Awesome. I think that's sage advice. Absolutely. So I've gone ahead and shared my screen with you and my sound so that we can watch the videos at the same time. Is it coming through for you?
Yep.
All right. So we will move then into the first video. This one is by Jeff Lawton. Been dubbed the Duke of Permaculture. Was he the Duke or was he the Prince of Permaculture? I can't remember now. By Bill
Uh,
Mollison himself.
yeah. The prince
The
and
Prince of Permaculture. That's right. Yep. So the one that Bill chose himself to kind of be the spearhead of his legacy and to carry on his work after his unfortunate. I mean, he did live a good long life, but unfortunately, he did pass in 2016. So Jeff Lawton is going to talk to us about swales and earthworks for conversion and storage. And this is part of his PDC preview. He runs an online PDC course, which I've heard good things about. I've heard that despite there being so many people enrolled in it, that you do get some good individual time. So that might be a good one to check out. Um,
yeah,
yeah,
I could say when I took it, I was really surprised because I look at I come to permaculture from leftist politics,
yeah,
and so to me, permaculture is all about grassroots community organizing. So I was a little skeptical, but you know what? He really the movement has become so diverse, and what's taught in PDCs is so diverse, and he's really streamlined it back to the original concepts that Bill Molson had, which I got to say are actually really radical,
hmm
and so I really appreciated it for that. And yeah,
very cool.
absolutely, he would if I had a personal question, he'd answer it.
Yes, and it appears you have a fan in chat. Jimmy Leaf Tenders, the handle, and he says, "Why not talk about some other people that do PDCs?" And I know for sure that you yourself, Mike, do an excellent PDC course. So if you want to say just a little bit about that before we start.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I'll have one coming up this fall and winter. You can find it if you're on Facebook at the Transformative Adventures group
Yep.
on Facebook, or
Oh,
transformativeadventures.org. I know you already shared the link there.
yep.
And again, I really take this idea of looking at it as a way that we directly seize wealth and access
Mm-hmm.
or control of productive assets in our communities. And so in my PDC, we get into like Alinsky style power mapping, and we
Oh
get into
wow.
like serious community organizing stuff. To me, we as permaculture designers, if you want to be successful about it, if you want to make a living do it, have it support your activism and have your your activism be more than just playing around in a garden. This is the kind of stuff we need to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a really vital component that is somewhat lacking in a lot of PDC courses. I know my one disappointment with my own course was that once it was done, people just kind of went all their own separate ways. There was not that one thing to kind of keep us all back tied together. So, I mean, I did some collaborative work with other colleagues of mine, but other than that, I haven't really been able to keep in contact with people, and I was kind of sad about that. So that's cool that you're adding this activism component, because to me that says that things can continue on as a group, as you know, just keep that momentum, and that, because there's always so much enthusiasm and creative energy just bubbling up all over the place in these PDCs, and it'd be great to really have that harnessed in a positive forward direction rather than just scattering at the end of it.
Absolutely. I mean, if we're not thinking like community organizers and serious change makers, what are we doing this for?
Absolutely.
I got to share one other thing that I think you
Sure, sure.
appreciate. Just at the Midwest Permaculture Convergence, I was really happy to see it was actually quite a radical space. And I was giving a talk specifically on I have a book coming out on designing or creating beautiful abundant landscapes
Wonderful.
with the beauty in mind. And so we're talking about gardening aesthetics, and for the first 20 minutes, I'm talking about like the Black Panther Party.
Nice.
I have no idea how you can even talk about gardening aesthetics without talking about the Black Panther Party.
Absolutely. Makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, and if you're not, then we're just end up like reinforcing, the idea that gardening and landscape aesthetics are just like a way of forcing conformity to classist and
Right.
and whiteness, So, but yeah, so I thought you'd appreciate that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah. We shouldn't have gardening and especially permaculture being viewed as just another lifestyle or hobby, or just another thing that's kind of a separate segmented part of your life that doesn't really have much value in your day-to-day pursuits. I think it should be, front and center in everything that you do. So that's wonderful. Great.
Cool.
All right. Well, let's get into the video right now. Anytime you want to stop, I like to keep this pretty casual. So anytime you want to stop, just let me know, and we can comment and riff however we see fit.
Cool.
All right, let's go.
Okay, let's have a look at swales. Swales are long level excavations that come in many forms and widths. They can be just small ridges in gardens, or rock piles across a slope, or excavated hollows in flat lands and low slope landscapes. They're not elements that fit into steep landscape. Like soil conditioning, swales loosen soils and absorb water, storing it in the soils and the sediments. They intercept sheet flow and let it infiltrate, recharging the groundwater. Overland flow is interrupted for a few hours or a few days, and then infiltration becomes regularly downwards. Water moving at right angle to conduit down towards the groundwaters as a recharge into the soils, and assisted by the tree roots. Trees are essential as components of swale systems. So most of the time our swales on slope, they're a mound excavated out from the trench to the mound, and our topsoil is increased at the mound and it's loose. Most of the time we're planting trees up on the mound here and just below. In deserts we may plant inside because we've got less rainfall and it's hard to drown the trees in the desert. So you may move inside, but the infiltration of water is at right angle to contour, and it plumes away as it sits here and then soaks in. We also plant the back slope, often leguminous trees on the back slope here, fixing nitrogen. And the roots here help the absorption. So the roots grow quickly, chasing the water as it goes down, slowly soaking in.
I have a question for you, Mike. This is something I've wondered about when building swales. Is if you're putting the trees on top of the mounds, is there any danger that you could? Because I know you're not supposed to put trees on top of like earthen dams, because the roots can channel water and eventually it can lead to the whole thing collapsing, basically. So do you think there's any danger in putting too many trees perhaps on top of the mound?
To me, if the mound is the right size, Bill Mollison himself said swales are tree growing systems. The thing that we really want is for those swales, for the mounds that we make, we could call that the berm.
The berm,
So
I meant to say,
the
yeah.
hole there is a swale, and the mound is a berm, and that thing can become unstable. But tree roots are amazing at holding that soil in place. So,
Okay.
so I do like that. The one thing that I like to be careful of, like in our climate, like everything, if you're in North America and you're watching this, the thing to keep in mind is that in Australia they actually have a lot of rain, but it comes small, like very rare, huge events. So they need these big swales to catch all that water. Like here in most of the United States, we don't have that pattern. So if we make a swale that's too big, the tree sits up on that berm, right? And
Right.
the water infiltrates too low below the tree roots.
Ah.
So yeah, so we actually end up destroying the landscape hydrology, infiltrating the water below the tree roots, and then the tree roots are all stay dry. So here, we're better to do shallower, broader swales. If we dig too deep, then we end up watering the soil that, it's good because we're recharging the aquifer. We're not watering our trees.
Right. Wow. Oh, so what USDA hardiness zone are you in, by the way?
I recently moved from a 6 to what's a 5. I moved south and went and moved from zone 6 to zone 5 because I was in Michigan, and Michigan has the Great Lakes, which are this great climate battery,
Right.
And yeah.
Oh, cool. My climate zone, depending on the map you look, has also crept up, although I haven't moved at all. I was in 4B, and now, by some accounts, I'm in 5A. The Twin Cities are now in 5A. So that's just more proof of climate change.
Absolutely. You know what? The funny thing about that is for the last 30 years, it's been creeping up, creeping up, creeping up. Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I was living, used to be zone 5, and then it moved up to 6. But then, if you actually looked at the temperatures, we were zone B for practically the whole of the last 20 years. But then, like 2 years ago, 2 and 3 years ago, we had the 2 coldest winters on record. At the same time, we had 2 of the hottest years on record. So those years, think about that. Those years were the 2 hottest years on record, yet they had the 2 coldest winters and lowest winter temps on record also at the same time. We're breaking records in both directions. So, a lot of the plants that have been thriving in the garden actually end up being zapped by those 2 cold winters. And that's our reality in climate change. We gotta be thinking about resilient systems.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not just about the average cold or the average high, really. It's the entire climate is shifting in many ways. Definitely this summer for much of the country, my region included, has been very dry. And that is irrespective of temperature. It just tends to be a lot drier. So that's another thing that permaculture designers will have to take into account. But swales are a good way to kind of mitigate the highs and the lows of rainfall, as you're mentioning in Australia. If you can catch and store that energy from the rainfall all at once, like you have a big rain event and you catch all that water, it can then slowly percolate out through the soil, and you can kind of even out what otherwise would be very wet and then very dry. So I'd say swales are a great tool against this climate shifting and climate change.
Yeah, and just to reinforce that, if you're listening to this and you're wondering, okay, but does this stuff really work? Well, I could say is that my last big project, Lily House Permaculture, was an urban site. I'm really into the idea that we have to be regenerating the places where people live and not just like running away into the cottage core fantasy. We've got to be regenerating
Right.
these are so. And it was the main garden was about a third of an acre. The whole site was an acre, but the intensive garden was a third of an acre, and it grew, pretty much all the food necessary for a family, for the people who lived in the house. There's usually a bunch of people living in the house, on just a few hours of labor per week, and uh, no irrigation.
Wow.
So none of the gardens required any kind of irrigation. And 2 of those years actually had record drought. So the worst
Hmm.
droughts that we had in those regions, going back to like the Dust Bowl era. And because of things like the swales in the garden, lots of swales, maybe we'll talk about like nurse logs, things like that. Those gardens didn't require any water. I have a new garden here using these same techniques, micro swales in an urban environment,
Hmm.
and this garden is killing it. And again, we've had drought. I haven't had to water it once. That is climate resilience right there.
Absolutely. And you mentioned nurse logs. That's not a technique that we've covered yet. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know what? For people who are watching this thinking, how do I dig this big kind of a swale out there? There's an ecological concept called the nurse log, and yeah, a lot of like the Amazon is
Hmm.
a food forest that was created by indigenous people, and one of the main techniques they used was copying what nature does. A, a tree falls down, and all sorts of life grow up from that because the fungi get in there and have this beneficial relationship with it. It kind of naturally mulches the soil there, and they're great at filtering in water. So if you
Hmm.
don't have the ability to dig big swales like what we'll see in this Jeff Lott video, you can get logs off the side of the road or have people drop them off at your house, and you can put these on contour just like a swale, and in about 1 year that will turn into a swale because all the sediment will build up behind that
Hmm.
log. And Bill Molson himself called this passive swaling. You can build
Wow.
a swale without digging a swale.
That's amazing. So you're not even covering these with soil, you're just leaving them on the ground, huh?
You're just laying them there on the ground.
Wow.
It's super counterintuitive. Think about this. There have been a bunch of studies on this concept because it's what we see in nature, and there have been a couple of studies that have reinforced this in multiple climates, in Mediterranean climates, in dry climates, here in Northern America. So it works everywhere. This just blows my mind. There there's a series of studies that show that you can take, if you're planting trees, right?
Uh huh.
You mulch all around that tree with wood chip mulch.
Right.
That sounds like a great way to conserve soil moisture. It's great for the tree.
Hmm.
But here's the blows my mind. Or you can just lay a log down by that tree and not have to run that log through a chipper, not have to spread out that mulch or make a weed barrier. It's just a log laying next to the tree seedling. Guess which one wins? The nurse log wins.
Oh,
The tree
wow.
growth, the tree growth and soil fertility, water holding capacity is better with just this log laying there than with complete covering around the tree of the mulch. So this is really counterintuitive to me because I would think that, if you're mulching, you're also defeating all the weeds around it. But you know what? Trees have this adaptive relationship, and the fungi have this adaptive relationship, and they know what to do with that nurse log situation, and it wins. It wins. So nurse log swales, passive swales, are a really powerful technique.
Man, that's incredible. I'll have to look more into that myself. I'm familiar with the concept of using logs in hugelkultur, which is basically making a berm with that nurse log inside of it as the core, but I hadn't heard of just using it out by itself before. So that's really incredible. I like that a lot. Um, and what I've heard with using hugelkultur mounds is that because you're putting so much carbon into the soil all at once, there's a tendency, at least for the first few years as it's breaking down, to suck a lot of the nitrogen out of the surrounding soil. Have you experienced that with your nurse logs? And is there anything you do to mitigate that, if so?
Um, there's actually research on this topic too. When you integrate that carbon, so what we're talking about is any decomposition. When anything dies, it
Mhm.
starts to break down into eventually composting. It decomposes into compost. It requires, two main ingredients for this to happen. It requires carbon and nitrogen, and those have to be present in about the right ratio for the microbes to be able to turn stuff that's alive into compost. And
Mhm.
so when you take a log and you bury it in the soil, there's
Uh-huh.
too much carbon for how much nitrogen is there. And so it slows down that process. It takes a long time and it binds up that nitrogen. So the plants can't use it. The microbes are using it to break down that log.
Right.
So right. So the plants can't have access to it until the log is broken down enough that that the microbes don't need it anymore and can release that nitrogen back to the plant. So a few years, like you were saying, it's different with nurse logs
Mhm.
because the fungi primarily are the nurse log is sitting on top of the soil and it's pulling down that nitrogen into the soil a little bit or carbon a little bit at a time, right?
Mm.
And so there's no nitrogen binding when you do that. Some of the other problems that come up with hugelkulturs, it's a great technique, and it ends with amazing soil. But they can also get a lot of weeds or grasses can infiltrate them, and then they're hard to deal with. A
Sure.
lot of those problems you don't have with nurse logs. So, hugelkulturs are great. I always consider them in spaces. I love them. And a lot of times nurse logs might actually be less work and work out better.
Wow, that's incredible. You're like blowing my mind here. That sounds like not only can you do less work, but you can get a better result than doing the hugelkultur way. So that's amazing. Very
The
cool.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say there is like if you're trying to grow like an annual garden, you
Mhm.
need bare soil to
Sure.
germinate seeds in. So that's where a hugelkultur really makes sense.
Okay.
Is got you got bare soil on top of those logs. You can start planting, your broccoli right in there this year. You don't have to. Whereas a nurse log is maybe better for if you already have like a garden bed.
Sure.
You can put nurse logs around it, or if you're planting trees, you can put nurse logs on it.
Okay. All right. So yeah, as I keep mentioning, it's situational. Which technique works best, and it all depends on what you're trying to get out of your landscape and what your local conditions are. So very cool. And also, I just want to address chat for just 1 minute. Thank you very much for the follow, Jimmy Leaf Tender. You're cracking me up in the chat here.
Yeah, he's great.
So yeah, all right. Well, let's continue on in the video a little bit.
Swales without trees risk waterlogging and local rainfall deficit because of the lack of evapotranspiration and the potential of too much water storage. Because they're on contour, interrupting the sheep flow, they stop all the water moving past, just temporarily, and then just soak it in. That water disappears into the soil. The trees take some of that back and transpire it to the atmosphere. Tree planting must accompany swales in all areas. So swales, I like to say, are tree growing systems.
Hmm.
And it's of utmost important in deserts where there's so much rain that's needed. So there's a chance that as you interrupt the flows of rain that come so infrequently and often in large events, you can stop it, soak it, grow trees that transpire more water to the cloud base. There's a chance it's going to increase the rainfall. It will definitely increase the condensation in deserts. The potential crown spread of the fringing trees. So as the trees grow, the crown spread from one side to the other, shading the swale. This is what we need to understand. The width of the swale can be governed by the crown spread that will shade our swale, further reducing water loss to evaporation and dissolving salt concentration and water loss, because this water won't evaporate, it'll soak. Now, the back slopes and the inside trenches of swales can be grazed. It's possible to run animals in here and put temporary fences up and graze animals on the back slope up to the inside of the mound. Eventually, it won't make any difference. But grassing this well won't have the same effect as the trees.
Did you say something, Mike?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay.
But I am thinking something, but we'll get to it in a second as we see some more of this.
Okay.
Grazing between the back slope and the hangover forage from the swale trees can be quite beneficial, because the manuring here in the swale, when it rains, dilutes right the way along the swale. You get an even dilution of manure all the way along, and that's soaking in. But
And that really plays into the concept of producing no waste. One of the worst things about like these concentrated agricultural feedlots is the concentration of manure, where it gets to the point where, you know, small towns will do anything they can to fight like a pig farm coming in nearby, because the stench is just so awful. But one way to mitigate that is to incorporate it into the soil. And if you're spreading it out more, you're getting more of it sinking in more quickly. There's more surface area for those microbes to break it down. So, very cool. We do have a question. Jimmy Leaf Tender wants me to ask you, Mike, why you like Turkish rockets so much and plum hedges.
Yeah, I mean, Turkish rocket is a great perennial vegetable, and if you're watching this and you don't know that vegetable, sometimes you'll find it actually in the United States and Middle Eastern restaurants. It's like a broccoli. It's a perennial broccoli, but it's a relative of arugula, so it has that same like arugula nutty spicy flavor, but it's broccoli. It's perennial, and it's like it's practically like a weed in a lot of places. So it's a vegetable that you almost can't stop it from growing. So that's pretty amazing.
Cool. And then the plum hedges.
You know, any kind of hedges I'm
Any
into.
kind of hedges.
We're looking at this these swales here. It's really interesting to note that back when we had the Civilian Conservation Corps in the United States, we put Americans to work building exactly what we're looking at right here, all over, especially the West, where there was the Dust Bowl going on, and these silty American soils were just blowing right away and creating a huge ecological problem. And so, you know, we put people to work restoring and regenerating soils and stopping an environmental crisis, and in a way that rebuilt the American economy from the base up, from the agricultural base up. We built swales all over this country, and we planted hedgerows on them. Like Jeff here is saying, you know, swales are a tree establishment system,
Right.
so we built hedgerows on them. And the hedgerows are also amazing. You know, they've been researched and found to be just like the best biodiversity and wildlife conservation measure we can do. They're amazing for building soil, and they stop the wind. There's a great study that shows if you just put hedgerows and break down farmland into about a square mile and put hedgerows around them, you would productivity of the farming system by 1/3, even reducing the farmland. You reduce the whole area that's farmland, but you increase the output by 1/3 just by putting in these hedges, because they break, their wind breaks and their fertility breaks. They reduce the amount of pesticides we have to spray. And yet right now, we put these things in. They were a miracle that ended the Dust Bowl. And right now, we're out there tearing them out everywhere. So we've got the university system actually pressing people, which when I say the university system, I actually mean Bayer Monsanto, right? They run the universities for the ag departments. And so we're tearing out all these hedgerows.
That's a tragedy. That's just a tragedy. That's an amazing fact that you threw out there. Increasing your productivity by 1/3 without giving up 1/3 of your land. Like it seems like a win-win in my estimation. Wow. And it's funny you mentioned those conservation Corps swales that were dug all over the U.S. West. My very first introduction to permaculture was watching Bill Mollison's The Global Gardener. And one of the things that he showed in the dryland segment of that video was those conservation corps swales. And he showed how just by doing nothing else but changing the contour of the land, you could create life where there appeared to be none before in this desolate, barren landscape of the U.S. Western deserts. And that was my light bulb moment. From that point on, I was hooked on this idea of permaculture, and I went to seek it out wherever I could find it after that point. So that's really cool.
My light bulb moment was very similar. Just seeing this idea, like I said, I came to this largely from being a leftist political activist. I was working more as an activist, and seeing this whole idea. Look at what we're looking at right here. We can build a world of abundance wherever we're at in our communities by these resources that Jeff right here is teaching us how to catch and turn into productivity, into biodiversity, into food for people.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, right now, we're just putting them in drains where we're usually, and then the history of water right now, if you're in a northern city where water goes, is the first thing it does, it falls, it goes on people's lawns right down into the street, right? Into the stormwater system.
Yep.
We have to pay tax dollars to maintain that stormwater system. And pretty much every North American northern city, the stormwater system was created with a really clever design, which is to take all of the water out of white neighborhoods and flood and send that water to people.
Yeah.
So this is why you go to any North American city and there's a rain and the white neighborhoods are dry and you have to like tread water through the POC neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
The typical thing. So that's the first thing that this water is doing when we don't catch and store it properly. Then it creates a pollution problem in our waterways, so we can't fish in them, swim in them, and then it goes out and it's creating the ocean dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. So we have a moral obligation to do this stuff too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you mentioned all the water being funneled to the poor, often people of color neighborhoods, and that definitely was on display during Hurricane Katrina. I think that was the first great example for myself of that in action, when you saw the most porous wards in that city being inundated first and having the highest casualties and the longest term effects, and having to wait the longest to get aid and rescue. So I think that's absolutely true, the way we treat water in these cities. And it's a crime because we could be using it for so much better things.
Right. We have the opportunity to turn that into productivity, into fertility in a way that we can be, growing to meet people's needs in our communities. It is a crime.
Absolutely. That also reminds me of the story of how Chicago used to get its water from, or I think it still does get its water from Lake Michigan. What used to happen though was that the Chicago River would flow into Lake Michigan, and during the heavy rainstorms, the stormwater sewers would get backed up, and it would overflow into, I think it would overflow into the sanitary sewers, and everything would just get washed out into the Great Lakes. And they would keep putting their intake further and further out, but they couldn't put it out far enough, because on these big rain events, it would wash all the sewage from the city out into the water intakes, and they'd just end up drinking their own sewage. So what they ended up doing was this huge feat of engineering where they reversed the river that runs through Chicago. I can't remember if it's the Chicago River or if it's the Illinois River, but one of the two. They reversed the flow of the river just so they wouldn't have to deal with that anymore. It's incredible the lengths we'll go to just to avoid problems that seem like they're much more simple to solve if we really thought about how we're using water.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't be just like putting our sewage into one of the world's great rare resources, potable water, and putting it out into another great resource, the Great Lakes.
Yeah. Wow.
And
people are funny.
And then creating fertilizer from fossil fuels.
Yeah, when we make so much of it ourselves that with just a little bit of forethought and good design, we could really be making more of a closed loop cycle and growing our food from the nutrients that would otherwise be waste.
Yeah, this is the time where we get to say one of our permaculture principles is the problem is the solution. And every time we talk about a problem like this, something that is messed up in the way America and the Western world, the corporate world is run today, all of these things are opportunities for us to intervene and turn these systems, transform these systems into things that are life enhancing and nature enhancing, and build this world of beauty and abundance that we want to see.
Oh, absolutely. Very well said. I appreciate that. That's right in line with Bill Mollison's "the problem is the solution" that he would so often say, where we just turn things on their head, look at things a little bit different. We can take what is supposedly a problem and engineer a solution out of it. So that's really good. All right, well, let's continue a little bit further on in the video.
You can't expect grasses and herbaceous growth to have anywhere near the same evapotranspiration to the cloud base. You've got to have the trees with their deep tap roots to increase that absorption. Swales can be widely used across the climates. Dryland areas, they can be very large because you've got to stop as much rain as you can when it comes in those large events and soak it in and get through most of the year, reassuring your landscape of trees, tree growth giving you shade, tree growth stopping evaporation from wind. They also, of course, work in humid tropics and humid cool to cold climates. And the hydration of the swale builds over about 7 years. Each year, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, it gets up to about year 7 and you've got the maximum rehydration plume, where each time it rains it comes a bit more and then you get to a maximum. And it will fully hydrate to the maximum size and then quickly drop off the bottom. They'll be recharged, the maximum recharge to the groundwater. So you have a dampened hydrology that wets up as quickly as possible. Water available from wet season to dry season. It doesn't matter that it rains in winter and your growing season is in summer, because it extends over one season. And the roots reach their maximum influence at about 7 years. So the roots of the trees are coming down and they're increasing the infiltration effect. Essentially, swales are always perfectly dead level with no water flow. So water sits passively, rises like a tide, and then soaks in. They're not compacted and they're not sealed. They're made to soak. They're uncompacted. Swale width and swale depth can vary in relation to the size of a property. Small properties, small swales, of course. Large properties can be quite large. Slope can make a difference. The speed of infiltration on local soil types. Shallower, wider swales in sands and narrower, deeper swales often in clay fraction soils. And after 1 or 2 good soaking rains, you can seed and plant your swale to trees. On both banks, because you've got a certain amount of soak on both sides, capillary action will take the water out to the back slope and on down. And it will take a few years to overshade the swale base and accumulate humus from leaf drop. There will be a certain amount of leaves coming in and accumulation of humus, but there will be, after a few years, a lot of leaf drop from the actual trees. And as efficiency increases, extra water can be let in. So you can lead in diversion drains from country, picking up water from hard surfaces, overland flow, extra water, enabling planting of high value trees. So you can bring in different trees as the swale starts to function better and better. You can increase the quality of trees. And the swale itself can handle more and more water over time. So that enables you to move the system up, advance it in quality. And that's what they're all about, advancing the quality of the system. Swales can be a great benefit with hard surface runoff in towns, particularly subhumid and arid towns. It can reduce the costs of the efficiency of stormwater runoff. Soak in the water into tree growth. Tree growth that can produce fuel, mulch, food products, even fireproof towns. All roof water and roof water tank overflows, grey water waste could be led to swales. And it doesn't really matter if swales are in sand or in clay, in sand or even cinder ash. They grow trees, initially pioneer trees, that slow and absorb and hold water for longer. And once established, high value trees can then be planted. And swales, at the opposite end of the scale, in heavy clays work well. Initially growing pioneer trees with roots that penetrate the clay, breaking it up and increasing the absorption. So it's not the material that you're swaling through, it's the pioneer trees that you might have to go to in sand as you're planting initially, or in clay. The different types of pioneer trees that actually favor the different extremes of material. And then as the conditions change, as you improve the absorption, as you improve the fertility, then you move into high quality trees. We know that this works. The trees grow faster and are healthier on runoff fed swales than trees planted in open country. In arid areas, it's most important we plant trees on swales, or salt concentration may occur downhill and collapse soils. So we know the trees are pumping the water cycle and stopping the concentrations of salts. Swales are just temporary events, really. Over the long period of time, they're replaced by trees. Trees take over the function. They are the precursors to the rehabilitation of forests in a region. And they give us that convenient contour lineage to work with. The base of a swale, when we look at the base of a swale, it can be ripped to increase absorption. It could be gravelled, so we can gravel the base of a swale. Or it could be sanded. And on small swales, they can even be mulched. So you can deep mulch a swale in a small swale in the garden. You won't have enough material for a large swale. Or you can put down gypsum to loosen clay if you're in heavy clay soils, to allow more.
So before we get too far beyond the point, I just want to bring up that he's talking about actively changing the local climate, using trees and earthworks to change the way that the soil conditions are. You know, bringing in plants that will be adapted to the current conditions and then change them to suit themselves better on, or future successions better on. The difference being, though, this is positive climate change. This is climate change that will create more cover for the earth to shield it from absorbing as much of the daily sun's radiation. This is climate change that will create more clouds, which themselves will reflect more light during the day and change the local climate. So climate change doesn't have to be a bad thing. It all depends on what your intentions are and how you're going about achieving it.
Yeah, this topic is so exciting to me, and I want to share something that I was waiting to kind of jump in on this.
Sure.
For him to finish with this thing, but what he's talking about, of the idea of why swales improve in their function over time. One of the keys here, and it's kind of an ecological concept. Life makes good for life, and the more like biodiversity, the more living things, the more organisms and trees that we have in an area, the more biomass, the better that becomes at harvesting resources that support life. And so we're talking about swales. I really like what one of the things he just said, which is that swales are really a short-term thing, because once you get to establish forests, there are studies again from around the world. This is actually considered kind of common knowledge. It's something that landscape architects use when they're just doing math about planning water infiltration for areas. So established forests, are considered to be able in almost every climate to catch and absorb and infiltrate nearly 100% of the water that falls on them, even
Hmm.
when they're on steep slopes. So he was showing a picture there of an established forest coming in around that swale. Once that forest is established, you don't need the swale anymore. That forest is the ultimate water establishment technique and or tool. You know, the forest itself will actually work better than a swale, like 100% of the time. So that's something really interesting to see. And I'd love to talk for just really briefly something that'll change the way you see ecosystems.
All right.
Is that there's such a thing as hydrophobic soils or water repellent soils. Soils can become hydrophobic and repel water, or they can become hydrophilic and love water and catch that water and soak it in.
Hmm.
And one of the things that moderates that are the plants and the microbes that are in the soil in an area. So these microbes and plants will tag team together. If you have something like one that could be knapweed, spotted knapweed is one that a lot of people are familiar with, and it has relationships with microbes that will create waxy compounds around soil particles, and will actually turn the soil in an area into something like desert. It'll keep the
Huh.
soil from soaking in water and holding the water.
Oh,
And the
wow.
reason spotted knapweed likes that, it thinks that it can outcompete, you know, plants that thrive in rich soils, right? If it turns those soils into hydrophobic soils. So what we're trying to do, and then there are other plants that break down those compounds and create compounds that turn the soil into things that actually catch the water. So when we're creating swales, we're creating the conditions where those hydrophilic, the water-loving plants and microbes can survive there long enough to transform that soil and create soil in which their team can win, right? And
Yeah.
defeat. So a lot of people, if you don't have room in your yard to build swales, you can still look at that soil and see, as you start looking around, you can start looking for what plant communities in your region create hydrophilic soils and which ones create hydrophobic soils. And if you, a lot of times I will start with a garden that has these plants in it that create hydrophobic soils. One of the first things I need to do is have a strategy for helping the good guys win out, for helping those plants that will turn that soil into water soaking rich soil and help them get established. If we can just get them established, nature will transform that soil for us into soil that is going to catch and store water, just like Jeff is talking about. So one of the things we're doing with swales is just giving those plants and microbes that will create water soaking earth that heads up.
That is incredible. Yeah. I had no idea that spotted knapweed actually changed the soil that way. I mean, I knew people didn't like it, um, and I was familiar with the idea that the things we tend to most often think of as weeds are often just pioneer species that do well in disturbed and degraded areas. I had no idea there were actually some of them that actively tried to keep the conditions disturbed and degraded. That's incredible. Um,
Now, the thing is, though, we can use those tools for good or bad. Yeah, there, and spotted knapweed does have some strong positive impacts on ecosystems too, but it wants to enjoy its place in succession for as long as it can before it balances out. And there will be a period of time where it's going to try to get its foothold in an ecosystem by making sure that the things that could outcompete it don't have the resources they need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, and what we're talking about here with changing the local environments and changing the local climate. That's something that I try to bring up a lot, especially when I'm doing this series. Is that when I try to define permaculture, more and more I find myself trying to define it as humans being co-creators of their local ecosystems. Um, you know, not just being a passive recipient of goods, not just trying to view it in a purely utilitarian way of what can I get out of it, but being both beneficiary and benefactor to the local ecosystems. So that's how I've been trying to define it quickly when people ask what is permaculture. What
That's great.
what is your go-to when you're doing like your elevator pitch? Someone says, "What the heck is permaculture?" What do you like to bring out?
You know what? I do, for people who are listening, if you want to have a really cool little community organizing tool that I learned, do you know the reason why I'm giving you kind of a long answer is I have a different elevator pitch for different types of people I talk to.
Aha, yeah.
If I'm talking to someone who's a suburban homeowner, and I have one elevator pitch. If I'm talking to someone who's an activist, I have a different elevator pitch. So you get
Mm-hmm.
an overview one, which is that it depends a little bit on who I'm talking to. So I'll go into things like that. It's something very similar to what you just said. I could tell people it's an easier way to garden if they just want to have a landscape that's easier. I might tell them, if there's someone who's a political activist, I might tell them that it's a way that we can meet our own needs better and support our activism by
Mm.
by by community organizing and building real wealth in our communities right from the nature up. And at the same time, we're solving a ton of problems. We are creating ecosystems that will nurture biodiversity, that will fight climate change, that will feed people and create local food sovereignty. And we're catching and infiltrating and stewarding water resources, uh, saving native species. We're doing all these things right in our own gardens.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a really powerful way of framing it. The idea that we're building our own power by using this approach, and in a real tangible way. That one of the reasons that systems such as capitalism have such a hold on everybody is because they force scarcity of so many resources. If people could grow their own food, distill their own fresh water, grow their own pharmacy, grow their own shelter, um, these large corporations and their backers would have much less influence on all of us. They would have much less power over all of us. They couldn't force things like people to take minimum wage jobs because it's either that or starve, because now there's another alternative. You don't have to starve if you're working together with your neighbors to meet your food necessities, to meet your shelter necessities, all these sorts of things. So I think that's a real powerful way of framing it. Yeah, I'm gonna have to going forward when I talk to activists. I think I will try to adopt a similar set of talking points too. So thank you for that, Mike.
Yeah, one of the things that Bill Molson would say in similar circles was permaculture is revolution disguised as gardening.
Yeah.
And talking about these things, what we are talking about is literally seizing the means of production over the things that we need to meet our needs. We are figuring out ways to grow housing sustainably in our local communities and our ecosystems from sun energy. We are figuring out how to grow food in that way, and we're doing it in ways that rebuild connection between nature and community.
Mm.
We're doing all this. This topic, the connection between what we do as activists and organizers and permaculture, is so vital to me, because over like 25 years of being an activist, I can say one of the big things that I see is struggles with burnout, And so not only are we creating a power base of real resources in our communities, we're doing it for ourselves. Someone who's doing permaculture activism and growing that garden for themselves and thinking about how they're going to meet their own needs in a sustainable way, someone who is creating a vision of that abundant world in their own backyard is going to be able to resource their activism better and do better work and help the other people who are doing activism in their communities also do that work without burnout. This is the connection here, the potential.
Absolutely.
Is so huge.
Absolutely. And if enough of us do it, especially if we're doing it collaboratively, then man, that's real power to shape the world more as we see fit, rather than allow ourselves to be shaped by large and powerful interests.
Yeah, like the big lie of today that you see all the time in the news and magazines everywhere is that you do not have power. We do not have power. The people who can affect the world are big thought leaders in Silicon Valley, tech,
Yes.
politicians. This is how we directly seize the power over what our lives are like, what our communities are like. It is, we have this power. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Man, that's so inspiring. So yeah, wow. Let's continue on in the video here.
Water infiltration. The spoil of the swale is normally mounded downhill, so our topsoil's there, the excavation has come over to our mound. But in flat country, there might not be a mound, because in flat country, we'll spread the material out on the lower side usually, but it won't look like there's a mound at all. So you'll get a flat profile of a swale. And the distance between swales changes to country. On hill country, the potential vertical height of the trees at maturity projected horizontally to the hill as a maximum density. That's an average sort of approach. So as a hill comes down and it changes in steepness, where we have our swales, the height of the trees projected back, the potential height of the trees comes back each time. And that's the maximum amount of swales we need. So as we go onto the steeper country, that projected height makes the swales closer together. As we get on the steep, it's closer. As we get on the shallow, it's further apart. But when we look down from the bottom of the hill, when we look up, all we can see is canopy. It looks like the whole landscape is forested, but there's lots of interswale there, because these are actual lines of trees. There's a group of trees in that line. But that's just a rough gauge. There's no exact about this. It can change to country. Another way to gauge distance is 3 to 20 times the average swale width, depending on rainfall. Most useful average size swale bases are around 1 to 2 meters, and the interswale space 3 to 18 meters, but there's no absolute average. It's more likely that the closer spacing in rainfall that's quite large, say 120 centimeters, 50 inches, and wider spacing in rainfall of light, small rains of 10 inches, 25 centimeters or less. In humid areas, the interswale is usually fully planted with hardy species, and many of them as mulch-producing species. In dry areas, maybe it's quite bare and mainly functioning as runoff for the swales themselves. But mulch will blow into swales and wash into swales. As water flows, it'll bring organic matter in. Organic matter will arrive in swales. and fine dusts and silts build up in the swale bases. They become deposition systems. They're collecting all kinds of detritus material. That in itself is increasing fertility. They naturally actually build soils, and over a period of time they will start to fill up and become level terraces over a very long period. But by then you've got a very large forest there. You don't need the swale. Or you can side cast the material out onto the mound and increase the mound. You can actually keep redressing it. Doesn't matter. You can even put domestic wastes and organic matter into a swale in buried pits. You can bury pits in a swale. This is like swale furniture, swale attachments. These will fill up with water and they will become rich soil deposits inside a swale, either in the mound or in the trench itself. And on windy sites, the swale spoil bank, this swale bank, it's actually a very sheltered starting place for plants and trees. And every 6 to 10 swale can be planted to a windbreak. Where wind is the limiting factor, you can use the swales themselves as windbreak swales, and the swales in between as production swales. So they go into another function. And we know ridges should always have windbreaks because ridges are out there in the wind, but also there's more condensation on ridges, and that condensation is a trickle down moisture with nutrient. And if it's swelling downhill, we're picking that up and spreading it out. Swale sections can be over deepened as well. So there are places where we can.
Just one thought that came up there with having a windbreak on the ridge line. It occurs to me that often the trees and the hedge plants that are used most often as windbreaks are also the ones whose leaves have the largest surface area. So I wonder if that makes them even better at catching that condensation as it comes up or down or over the ridge.
Oh yeah, very, very interesting point. I think a lot of trees that are pioneer species in general seem to have some features, like we were saying before. Trees are the great water catchers and infiltrators. So they have some amazing abilities to do that work. It's pretty phenomenal to learn about. You know, the amazing thing too. When I was getting into permaculture, I was still kind of thinking like a vegetable gardener. So it was like, okay, these are trees, fine, but how is this going to help me grow my veggies? You know, I'm much more interested in the perennial crops and the trees and the Turkish rocket than I am in my tomatoes. But yeah, I still love to have tomatoes.
Sure.
The interesting thing about trees is that they're great resource sharers too.
Mm-hmm.
I think you'll like this metaphor. I'm using this metaphor for you specifically here.
All right.
So they love sharing these resources. So when you plant something like a swale and you're seeing these become fertility systems and they become water systems, the trees have a relationship with fungi, and the trees and the fungi together will actually share those resources with other plants in the ecosystem. Now, this is really surprising if you are approaching things from an idea of like a Darwinian competition, because we tend to think that, like, you know, we would keep all those resources to ourselves. If you were that tree and you were that good swale, why would you share those resources with some other tree that's not in your good swale?
Mm-hmm.
The thing that the trees know is that if one tree in the system does not have the resources that it needs to thrive, then that tree could become a target for pest and disease that could end up becoming a vector for the other things in the system. So the trees understand that they all do better when they all do better. So the trees will actually share these resources with plants that don't have access to them to make sure that the forest itself is a healthy, abundant, productive system for everyone, because they know that if some of those trees, if some of the plants don't have access to resources, that puts them all in danger.
Wow.
Trees are the original socialists.
Oh, that's incredible. So what it sounds like you're saying is that the law of the jungle is not so much a law, but more just something that's been projected onto the jungle unfairly by people that want to make it so.
Yeah.
That's cool. I like that a lot. Yeah. Ah, wow. Trees the original socialist. I'm going to have to remember that catchphrase too. That's really good. All right. Well, moving along.
Can put in deep sections. And this is most effective in clay fraction soils, creating kind of ephemeral ponds. Where if we're in sands, we can often go into widening for more effect. And in volcanic fraction soils, which are like sands as well, very absorbent, there we can create soak pans that readily absorb water and increase the groundwater recharge. Swales can be kept to a convenient width. So they can be a foot track, or they could be a wheelbarrow track in a garden, or they could be on a small property, a quad bike track, or they could be a tractor track on a large property. They can be used for transporting supplies in and produce out. There are many different functions for a swale. You need to get a longer swale to get material in, to mulch, to compost, to fertilize, to water possibly in really dry periods. You might want to flood a swale if you've got dams uphill. And you need to get product out. They're a convenient way to get across country because they're perfectly level. We are continuously surprised at the performance and function achieved by swales.
So that's just our first video on techniques in permaculture, and wow, there was a lot to cover in that, a lot of jumping off points and stuff. And it's amazing how something so simple can be such a powerful tool if applied correctly in the landscape. Very cool. All right, did you have anything else you want to add about swales before we move on to our next video?
No, just that, again, if you don't have a landscape that's big enough where you can be out there digging swales, we can still be inspired by these ideas. Think of all the other ways we can build swales in our lives. We can look at resources and catch and store resources in our. When we start talking about local economics, we can talk about the same thing. How do we build swales for money so that the money isn't just all rolling downhill and going out into the metaphorical Gulf of Mexico, where it does damage to ecosystems? How can we catch it and spread out the money, slow it down, and soak it into the local economy so that we can build swales in that? We can build swales with our relationships too. You know, when I'm online, for example, when I'm working with people as a community organizer, I'm always thinking, how do I catch and store the energy of meeting people into the kind of world that we really want to see? Every time we have an interaction with someone, it's a chance to catch and store that social capital into collaboration and cooperation. You were talking about being disappointed at the end of your PDC.
Yeah.
Everyone went in different ways. You know, we need to build swales and figure out what that means and what that looks like so that we're catching and storing the energy of our political and social capital too.
Ah, what a great metaphor. I think that's really applicable to so many of the things we're doing. You're absolutely right. We should be looking at these different things as opportunities to catch and store all types of energy, social capital, expertise, all sorts of things that we could be looking at as swales in our lives. Thank you very much for that. That's man. Yeah, that's something that's going to be knocking around in my brain for a while. I know for sure, as I see it in different parts of my life going forward. So yeah, thank you so much.
Cool.
All right, let's move on to the next one. Next, we're going to talk about the forest garden. And what is a forest garden? I think that can tie in very nicely with swales. So let's take a look. Another one from Jeff Lawton.
What is a food forest? Well, we're all quite familiar with forests, and forests as an ecosystem with great diversity of plants, animals and fungi, all harmonizing together and interreacting in many, many niches and layers, designed by nature, maintained as a system in perfect balance. Well, imagine that as a system that produces food. The majority of the elements in that system being productive. That's a food forest. So by understanding how nature designs forest systems so they're self-maintaining, self-replicating, we can model that system with productive species so that we can produce food in the most sustainable way with the minimum amount of input for the maximum amount of output anywhere in the world. That's a food forest system that we can actually design and work with in long-term and permanent situations.
And if you're listening to this or watching this and you happen to find yourself in a large city, just imagine if this sort of thing was applied to every city park and every vertical space within a city. There's so much space that we can be doing this in if we just, I hate to say, but think outside the box a little bit and look around and see what more we could be applying this to. People talk about just, planting fruit trees along medians. That always gets a ton of likes when I share sort of meme like that on Facebook. But we can go far beyond. Every tree in your local park could be a tree that does more than just shade and look nice. It could have several other functions too. And if we find a way to collectively manage it together, then it could be a whole lot more abundance for all that without ever having to plow another acre of field. I mean, that's another point too. As population rises, it has more demand for food, but there's only so much land in the world. Well, here's land that's already being used that we could just use better. Imagine if we applied this to balconies. Every new high-rise that goes up in my city and Minneapolis, that's a residential high-rise, I should say, has a balcony on it, and almost none of them use any part of it. That's a whole lot of surface area that they could be growing just a little bit more food, a little bit more of a lot of things, really.
Yeah, to me, this is one of the big solutions to the human problem. When I look at what our big problem in the world today is, a lot of people say climate change, but to me, we also have a couple of other big problems. And one of the other big problems is, of course, we're in the middle of the sixth great mass extinction event. And no species as large and clumsy as a Homo sapiens has ever survived the mass extinction event.
Yep.
And this one is happening at a faster rate than any other time in world history. So we have a crisis of biodiversity and species as well at the same time as climate change. And we have to continue to feed a growing population. We need land. So what do? If we can fight climate change by planting trees and having things that sequester carbon and mitigate the climate, but then we're taking land away from agriculture, so we're not going to have enough food to feed people.
Sure.
And we're taking land away from, if we put land into those two things, we're taking away from biodiversity. What we're looking at right here in this image is a way that we can grow food for humans at the same time that we're providing habitat for non-human species. And what you're looking at is a picture of the world's greatest carbon sequestration, climate change fighting technology ever invented. So this means that this thing that we're looking at, the great question is, what are we going to prioritize? Are we going to fight climate change, feed people, or save biodiversity? This is the way we do all three of those things at once.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. Yeah. I think that's really the promise of permaculture is that idea that we can do all of this stuff, all the things that Bill Mollison had this quote where he said, "All of life's problems can be solved in the garden," and every year that I go, that quote becomes more and more true, as I see the way that these things could be applied to urban design, to just the way we do agriculture too. How much less space we would have to use if we were doing agriculture primarily for feeding people an abundant and varied diet, rather than all the other things we do it for: corn syrup and even animal feed and ethanol production. It's just incredible how much land is devoted to things that are, or supposed agricultural land is devoted to things that are not at all feeding people, or at least very indirectly feeding people. So yeah, there's so much potential
Yeah,
out there.
a lot of our agricultural land is devoted to uh, justifying tax breaks to billionaires. that's that's what we
Yup.
like, use the land to justify giving tax money to billionaires
Absolutely.
on land. And that's like that quote is so great. We can solve all the world's problems in a garden. Listen to the problems we've been talking about tonight. We have a society that has unjust distribution of resources, where we have billionaires who own all the land, all the farmland is these big corporatized kind of systems. We could solve that with this picture you're looking at on the screen right here of a
Mm-hmm.
centralized food system where you and I have access to food sovereignty right in our own neighborhoods. We were talking about how the stormwater system is set up to flood, low income neighborhoods whenever it
Right.
rains, that rich people don't have to worry about that. And you know what? What were we saying is the great water filtration system? Trees. A food forest like what we're looking at right here could actually have water pumped into it, and not only would it be not be a problem for it, it would actually turn that additional water into fertility and send it down into the earth to recharge the aquifers that we're draining with. There's another problem right
Absolutely.
there. We're draining all of our aquifers. They're all
Oh
at
yeah.
levels. We could be fixing it with this garden that you're looking at right there. So it does all these things. It fights climate change. It recharges aquifers. It changes the corporate ownership model of our food system. It can fix this problem of the flooding of low income neighborhoods. Does all this at once. Why
It's
aren't we doing this?
Why aren't we doing this? Yeah. It's frustrating, but at the same time, it's so hopeful that there are actual, real solutions to these huge global problems that people talk about day in and day out. And um, yeah, yeah, it's weird, that double edged thing of hope and frustration all mixed into one, because we're not yet doing it at the level that we should be. But we could. You're absolutely right. There's nothing really stopping us other than the will to do it, and the knowledge to do it. It's a big reason I do this show. I mean, it's the primary reason I do all of my streams, is to just get that information out to just a few more people, so that we can start moving in this collectively better and positive direction that uplifts everybody and brings them at the same time closer to the ecosystems they literally depend on for their survival. So, but yeah, you mentioned the draining of all the aquifers. I think of the big arid city, or the big cities in arid places such as like Las Vegas and LA, where, I mean, it's hard to imagine how they're going to be around for that many more years at the rate they're going, at their population rise, the amount of land they put under irrigation that just evaporates up into the desert heat. Um, I mean, talk about doing everything you can to avoid permaculture principles and practices. It's it's sad, um, but at the same time hopeful, if they, if at least they start looking at these ideas. Perhaps they can turn it around. I still don't know how they can support as many people as they do into the future, facing all the drought and other pressures that we face. But yeah, so
Yeah, we may see an era of climate migration happening, and we're going to have to balance that as compassionately as we can. Those priorities too. Do we put the resources into saving cities that probably are never going to be sustainable?
Right.
And I say that, and I want to say that I know people who love those places. I
Mm-hmm.
love those places, and at the same time, we want to be compassionate about how we do things in ways that we're honoring communities and not. Yeah, so these are tough things that we're going to have to figure out, and I do think what we're looking at right here are some of the solutions that will allow us to solve these difficult priorities and decisions in the best possible ways we can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's definitely I think it's definitely our best hope for the future. I mean, no matter what part of the globe we're talking about, I think permaculture has something to offer. It's very true, very true. All right, continuing on.
And if I can throw in
Oh,
one more
sure,
thing while,
sure.
while we're talking about that, if anyone's listening and they're not familiar with Brad Lancaster
Hmm.
and books on dryland water harvesting, check those out, because yes, we have tools that can help with these problems.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'll throw Andrew Millison in as another name. We had been going through a bunch of his videos, and he did most of his permaculture study in dryland areas, so he has a lot of information about that as well. So that's another one there. All right, moving on.
All forests have layers. So you start off with a canopy layer, that's the top of the forest. Then you have understory layers, and under those you have bush and shrub layers, going down to herbaceous layers, which are non-woody plants. And then you have a root yield. You have plants that actually have large starchy roots. And then on the ground you have ground covers, and you also have a vertical layer of climbers. Now all forests have those layers. In the tropics you can have emergent palms and understory palms, and you can have slight variations in different climates, but you have a basic set of layers that occupy all the space. When we design a food forest.
And I'll just throw one more layer in there that is often overlooked, and that's the aquatic layer. Um, we've talked about swales and infiltrating water, but if you want to have it so that the water is not infiltrated, aquatic systems can be quite abundant as well, and provide a lot more edge than just using the drier terrestrial systems. So just thought I'd throw that out there as well.
And I'm going to add one more layer that is from, by the way, the systems that we're talking about right now, obviously most of them, there were systems like this all around the world, including in ancient Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the ones that we have good models for today come from indigenous societies, and we have been researching those. And there's something that's come out of the research literature that's not quite so common in the permaculture literature yet. I would like to see that change a little. Is one more layer that I always want to think about, which is the human layer. And in fact, the way most academic researchers define these systems isn't just by the plant layers and biotic community layers, but part of the very definition of what this kind of system is, a food forest,
Mm-hmm.
is that it integrates social function. Almost all of them are valued, not just because they grow food, but they're valued by people because they are culturally important. They have spaces for cultural uses, they have traditions and cultural traditions associated with them. And I've become convinced that we as permaculture designers need to be thinking about this every single time. If we design a food forest or a forest garden, we need to be thinking, what is the human function? What's the social function, not just food, that this ecosystem supports?
Absolutely.
We don't include that thinking. A lot of these systems end up failing because people build a food forest or plant an apple tree, and then they're like, oh, well, I need a place where the kids can can play softball. So we cut down the food forest 2 years later to build a softball diamond. So if we build these things around social functions, vital social functions, they tend to last better. And I just want to give one story about this from the study of forest gardens in Nepal.
Sure.
Or it's home gardens in Nepal. Home garden is another term used for forest gardens there by researchers. And they pointed out a really interesting. These are ancient systems, and now everybody has them in their gardens. They have for millennia. But now everybody in their food forest has a space for taking pictures, because these days they still have an ancient way of life and they're growing food the way they were 1,000 years ago. But everybody's got a cell phone, and so everybody in their forest garden has this like family portrait backdrop area in their food forest, where the function of it is to look pretty when they're all getting together to take their pictures, or if somebody's having a wedding and all of that. So all of these systems integrated in the human layer.
Ah, that's so cool. That's a great story. Yeah, and beauty is one of those uh, maybe overlooked elements in these designs when especially permaculturists are trying to conceptualize and set things up, because they're more concerned with production. But I think it's indispensable. I mean, it's hard to love a system that you don't find beautiful. It's that real emotional, visceral connection to the place you're at, what makes it yours and unique from all other places. So that's very important too. And then also, I just want to add one more thing that Jimmy wanted to add their bid for the mycelium layer being yet another layer that we should talk about too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You got it. You need the fun guys in there.
That's right.
Uh, you know, the thing about beauty is so interesting, because for a long time we didn't even recognize that these systems existed in Europe, and now we're waking up to the fact that, oh yeah, there are all these great systems in Europe too that are forest garden systems. And like, for example, in the Germanic speaking countries, these systems were called Straubst or Straubstweissen, depending whether they were uh, and uh, and there was a study on the value of these Straubstweissen and Straub systems. Another one is in Poland. They're called Mosaic Landscapes, because they integrate in tree systems and fruit and orchard systems, a lot of times animals and vegetable production into these forest gardens. So they're called a mosaic of all these different uses. So they're called Mosaic Landscapes there. And there's studies on both of these. In Spain, they're called the Dehesas. There's studies there too. And in all of those places, they show that these systems are amazing biodiversity systems. They have more biodiversity than just native landscapes do alone. And they produce very valuable community economic services. But in all these places, one of the things that they point out is, again, cultural traditions. People go to the hedgerows for their family picnics. They go to the Dehesas to forage together as part of their family traditions. And they're recognized for the beauty of the landscape. What makes Spain look like Spain? It's the Dehesas. What makes the German countryside look like it? It's the Straubs. These systems give the community their character. They create beauty in landscapes that we Americans don't have this. So we go to those places so that we can see these beautiful landscapes. The beauty is an amazing value added component to it that you just don't get in a cornfield.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And that brings to mind, I used to be a delivery driver for FedEx, and one of my most of my routes would be out in the countryside. And I remember I'm a amateur photographer. I love nature photography myself, and I would find that as I was roaming around during the winter months, there was always beauty. There was the frost on the tips of branches, or frozen berries, or snow falling in a pretty fashion. But once it got around to summertime, I would struggle to find things to take pictures of, and I always thought it was so strange. Like, summer's my favorite season. It's abundance and green everywhere. why are there no beautiful vistas in the summertime? And I think it's because it was all just cornfields. And like, there is beauty in a cornfield, but once you've seen one, you've basically seen them all. There's nothing really unique or it doesn't really transport your mind or your emotions anywhere. Just seeing another cornfield. So that's
Yeah.
quite interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah, and this to me becomes about how do we make this happen? How do we create this world we're talking about? To me, beauty is one of the big things that drives it because it's something that becomes, that makes it viral.
Mm-hmm.
So think about it this way. You know, we were just talking about Spain and Germany, or we talk about these same kind of systems in South America and all in Asia and all over the world. All the places that we Americans spend our time working for Ronald McDonald, so we can save up money, so we can finally escape the the corporate way of life in America and go to some place where they still have intact connection to nature and
Mm-hmm.
and we go there because of that connection we feel that system, we feel that connection, and then when it's time to come home we like cry because all that's waiting for us at home is our lives and Ronald McDonald. What if we could get this thing right? If we could solve our problems by rebuilding this world of beauty and abundance, then when it was time to come home, we wouldn't cry because of our lives were so dismal and the American landscape was so boring to us. We would cry tears of joy because our landscapes are so beautiful and our communities so beloved to us and our lives are so meaningful. And if we can get that right, we won't have to twist people's arms as activists to make change. If we can get this right, people will line up for this better world like it's the new iPhone.
Absolutely, absolutely, very well said. And I've been kind of trying to kick around in my mind this problem that philosophy has had for it's ageless and it's basically unsolvable, and it's known as the is-ought gap. Science and philosophy can describe the world as it is. They can come up with a pretty good model of the way things work, the way people's interpersonally work, and all that sort of thing. But neither of those things can tell how the world ought to be. It can say, if you want this sort of an outcome, then you should probably do this, that, or the other thing. But it can't say, you need to do this because of this, this, and the other thing. It's the is-ought gap that cannot be bridged in philosophy and science. But I think with things like beauty and really trying to connect people to the land, it's the emotion. If you can evoke some sort of emotional reaction in people, then I think that can be that anchor that you know will get people to care enough about things that they do want to move things in a certain direction or move things towards a better world. That is to say, so
Uh,
backing up just a little bit, you can throw as many facts and statistics about global warming and climate change and environmental catastrophe and the slave labor that so much of our products depend on, all of these things. But if the person you're throwing it at doesn't care, then they're going to do no good. They will be all of no avail. But if you can get them to care, and I think that the beauty is one conduit in, then you do have a chance of convincing people of your worldview and your proposed solutions for moving us forward.
yeah, I just mentioned earlier that I spoke at the Midwest Permaculture Convergence yesterday. And the person who spoke before me was Sister Ginny. And people in Southwest Michigan or in this region know her as kind of our permaculture matron. She was one of the first people in the region to come here and be a permaculture activist. And she was one of the people. She was organizing an eco village project. It was called Manitou Harbor, and I was involved in that like 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the project ended up falling apart because people just did not get what we we were trying to do. But the thing is, and so I think she felt disappointed about that. But one of the things is that work that she did ended up creating this viral change we're talking about, because so many people who were involved in it went on to continue to do this work like I have. And the reason why was because of the vision of beauty that she was able to share with me. What I found compelling was this vision, a beautiful vision of the world that we deserve if we would stop just trying to turn everything into money all the time.
Yes.
And that stuck with me. And it's why I'm still doing this 20 years later. And you know what? When I had a mature permaculture system and hundreds of people visited it, came through, and I love food, so I thought people would want to be talking about like how awesome my tomatoes were and my compost, and I thought people would want to be talking about how this is the solution to climate change. And every single time people would come through, what people wanted to talk about more than those things was just how beautiful it was. That when you create a forest garden, when you create a permaculture system on any scale, even if it's on your balcony, people will see that, and that vision of what our world could be like will be contagious for people.
Oh, yeah. I think that is the real power. Yeah, that's good to hear. That is, yeah, that's just good to hear, I guess. Yeah, man, I could just keep going on about this, but I'd like to keep the video rolling along. I think after this video is done, it'll be time to kind of have people ask final questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So let's continue on in this particular video.
For us, we put that layering system into action to our benefit for production and maintenance through function. Here in the subtropics, you have tamarillo as an understory, and you have taro and cocoa yam and cassava as a root yield. That changes from climate to climate. Then you have understory productive trees like feijoa, guava, and citrus, and large herbs like bananas. And then you have support species like the ice cream bean and the tipuana tipu and casuarina. They're large trees, but they continue to support the forest by cycling nutrient. You also have understory nitrogen fixers like the acacias and the leucaena and the cassia and albizia species. They're all really good, fast functioning, fast carbon pathways that fix nitrogen and can be chopped to the ground for mulch as the space that they're occupying can be taken up by the productive species. Here we have rose apples, mulberry, we have large legume trees, and we have large fruit trees. So we have jackfruit, the largest fruit in the world. We have bunya pine, a very large nut, but we also have pecan, which is a nut tree here that's also deciduous, loses its leaves in winter. Then we have your classic mango as a large overstory tree. These are all space occupiers in a system that's incredibly stable when all the layers are complete and occupied. We can plant food forests by planting support species at the same time as the fruit trees and managing the support species to shelter and boost the productive species. Or we can just plant the pioneer support species until we get a stable canopy. But we don't want to go the other way round. We don't want to start with the productive species and work hard with lots of inputs to keep them in a healthy state. The support species do the work for us. It can be up to 95% of the mass in the early years are the legume trees and the mulch producing trees that produce the biomass. We prune these, and these trees shed nitrogen to the soil because they have relationships. They're classic pioneers, and most are nitrogen fixing species. In other words, they have rhizobium bacterial partners in the soil that take nitrogen from the air in the soil and bring it into their plant bodies. And they then eventually die, and that nitrogen is added to the soil. Now we can speed that process up. We can sacrifice those species with good timing after we've put them into relative placement. So over time, the species we sacrifice open up opportunities for our productive species. They shelter and support and provide the fertilizer, the soil conditioning, and the humus. So we stack the system in space, but we prune in relation to time. So we wait for the time of year when there is more rainfall than evaporation. After the period where it's been dry and the evaporation is higher than rainfall, there we need shade, and we leave the shade up. But as soon as the rainfall gets heavier and higher than the evaporation, we can start to cut and open up light avenues and space for our productive species to take up the gap. Now over time, when we get to establishment, we've got less and less mass in pioneer support species and more mass in the productive species. And we end up with a reversal of mass. We have 95% productive and only 5% in support. So we don't just stack in space, we stack in time, and we speed up the process. These legume support trees that have been cut off as pollards may look a bit harsh, but they very quickly start to regrow. You can see here little shoots coming everywhere, and they're all the same. With the regrowth, we get a beautiful shade. Now that's handy in the hot time of year when we've got a lot of evaporation over rainfall, and it's actually a nurse crop for your fruit trees when they're young. Later on, we may cut them more regularly and keep feeding the soil, and eventually we may cut them out at a lower cut. They'll shoot a few more times, we'll keep adding that mulch, and eventually we'll cut them at ground level and not allow them to grow leaves, so they actually die out. It's our choice. We're actually manipulating the forest so that it grows in our favor towards productive species. We change the way it grows in our favor. So here you see the pollard regrowth. And in just a few months in the subtropics, you can gain all this wood. Now it might be once a year in a temperate climate, once every 6 months, every 3 months in the tropics. You're working with the cycles of the forest within climate. So you're feeding the soil with a fallen forest, and you're designing the way the forest falls. We can use animals to help us establish food forests. We can graze with larger animals, then they have to be out of the way because we're putting in small plants. We can put in poultry, chickens and ducks, and they can prepare the ground. And then later on, when the trees are up, we can bring in maintenance cycles of chickens and ducks to speed the system up. And that way, we can use our animals to gain an advantage while they're productive for us at the same time. I'm sitting in a food forest that's been recovered by ducks. This section here was well out of maintenance. I had quite a lot of long clumping grasses and unwanted plants we call weeds. We've put a fence around it, a temporary fence, electric fence, but we haven't even electrified it. We put in 100 or so Muscovy ducks. In just over 3 weeks, they've totally changed the area. They've eaten most of the green material, they've flattened out the grasses, they've manured the ground, they've conditioned the soil, and it's ready for replanting with the support species and interplants and fruit trees where there's gaps. Taking this time advantage, this process of dynamic event, we can now jump in and put in a whole assembly of plants that'll bring it to a diverse interactive stability and possibly go right through to maintenance without ever needing this event to happen again. This is taking time advantage from an animal interaction to a replant, which we can do any time we slip up on our maintenance. Just 3 weeks ago, the ducks were here. Now it's recovered. We've planted in the support species and extra fruit trees. We've established extra ground covers, and we've got a little footpath surrounded by wood prunings, branch prunings going right the way through on contour. It's on its way, and it's probably going into a permanent stable system from here on in. Forests function as a living ecosystem, and they are so diverse and so stable, and there is nothing like this in modern agriculture. Nothing as diverse, nothing as stable, nothing as fertile. The production of soil is constant. The fertility is constantly increasing. The diversity of production is non-stop. So with a food forest system, you have a system that self-replicates over time. There are no systems that produce as much per square meter for the smallest amount of inputs. This is a system that is proven, even in urban agriculture. Many people have heard my quote, "You can solve all the world's problems in a garden." But what a lot of people don't know about that quote is, I'm referring to food forests. They will work anywhere. And these systems give us permanent security worldwide. We just need people to realize that if we all move in this same direction, we can solve all the world's problems in our food forest gardens and supply all our needs without causing any damage whatsoever. In fact, we, humanity, can be the most beneficial element on this planet.
Whew. Well, that was a big chunk, so I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say about that. So, if I could just ask you your thoughts on that last chunk before we get into questions from the audience.
Well, fantastic, and I think it just kind of it was a great summary to everything that we had been talking about. Something I like this, like the duck system, the integration of the animals that he was talking about. So many of the systems that I kind of mentioned, Spanish dehesas and Swales and Mosaic Landscapes, and we can talk about the apple walnut forests, and we can talk about all these. A lot of times, animal systems are integrated in with them, and so the potential there for productivity is so high, or as Jeff would say, we could take advantage of a production of ducks in time with an abundant system of duck production. Like sometimes I love my favorite people on the planet. Like I'm pretty sure those words, the order you said them, don't have any right making any sense, but they make perfect sense. They're so eloquent, so it's quite amazing.
I have to say too, I saw your videos a little while back there where you lovingly parodied Jeff Lawton, and man, I don't know anyone who does a more spot on impression than you. You must have worked hours on that, so kudos to you.
He's just so charismatic, and so he just gets in your head.
But
the whole bit there was so beautiful and beautifully said. So it was really a poignant way to end that talk. The one thing I will say, from looking at the management of these systems, all of those kinds of systems that we're talking that I had mentioned, and this is kind of one of the big pieces of work that I don't feel we have quite ironed out yet, which means it's an opportunity for us. And that's that we as permaculturists are kind of making new systems, and we're trying to figure these out. And there's kind of a danger there that we're going to recreate colonial or capitalistic ways of creating these systems that just end up exploiting people instead. Whereas all those traditional systems around the world, they almost always have forms of really smart collective, I will say anarchistically organized collective design systems. There are very interesting ways of managing the commons that they've evolved over millennia of co-evolution with these productive ecosystems. And I would just say anyone who's looking at creating these in an urban environment or with other people, we need to start looking at why those systems work so well in the Spanish dehesas or in the Kyrgyz apple walnut forest. What are they doing there in the ways that they are allowing people to create worker-owned micro enterprises in these spaces is the way they often work, and yet they're very collaborative and cooperative in how they manage them together. So they have amazing systems that we should really be looking at and replicating. We shouldn't just be replicating the plant systems, we should be replicating the social structures that make them work so well there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's so vital. And permaculture was really smart to try and look at the ways that indigenous cultures around the world had done things, the way they interacted and met with the land. And there's so much vital knowledge about every place in the world that unfortunately is being lost as these cultures more and more are assimilated into the greater cultures that have unfortunately colonized them. So it's so vital that we try to look to people that literally have been here for millennia and try and see how they have done things, because they managed to do it with without wiping themselves out. They managed to find at least a dynamic equilibrium as a part of the ecosystem. So yeah, I just feel it's very vital knowledge that unfortunately is being lost little by little.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Jimmy has been dying for me to ask you a couple of questions here.
So I say really quick too that I'm looking at your screen if you're watching the video here, and I haven't wanted to switch back to Twitch because I don't want to screw things up. So I haven't been able to see a lot of the chat, so I'll have to be able to look back at it later. So I look forward to that. If I haven't responded to things that were in that chat, that's the reason why I can't.
Sure. Yeah, it can be quite a balancing act. I tend to just look at chat on my personal phone and don't even look at it through my computer either, so that I can be in two places at once, basically. But yeah, Jimmy has been definitely the biggest contributor. So the first thing they want me to ask you is for you to tell me about the migrant workers that you met and what they told you.
Oh yeah, I actually worked for a number of years, primarily through McHenry County College, but also with like the Adult Learning Resource Center in Chicago. And McHenry County, Illinois has a large migrant worker population, and I mean I've heard a lot of really interesting stories. I'm not sure if there's one in particular that he wanted me to reference there. But so I mean, it was quite a life experience to see that, and to see that a lot of people don't know this, but when was the last time we had a raise in the minimum wage for farm labor?
Oh, for farm labor. Oh, geez, I don't even know. I don't even know what it's at right now, in fact.
Yeah.
I assume it's different than standard minimum wage, though.
Yeah. One of the compromises, starting I think the last one was in 1969. So one of the compromises in every minimum wage increase since then, and it's right at the federal level, it's in federal law. So agricultural labor everywhere in the United States, states can't contradict this, is set by the feds to be to have a labor law exemption. So there's a minimum wage exemption, and so it's usually set. It can be set by the amount of produce people pick, so long as it doesn't go under about the equivalent of $3 an hour.
Oh.
So yeah, and so we have a huge underclass in the United States of people who a lot of times they're kept in situations where they don't have access to education. They don't, they work in a company store kind of situation where usually they live on the land of these big industrial farms in FEMA trailers. It's legal. Agricultural exemption says that you can legally house people long term in FEMA trailers in the
Oh my
United States,
goodness.
and they don't make enough money to pay to ever get out of the system of generational poverty. So we have people trapped in generational poverty now for generations, going back to before that labor exemption rate was set, and they make $3 an hour basically. And so yeah, you talk about having slave labor in the United
Yeah,
States.
really.
We think at the very least that we only have slave labor of children in Indonesia, which is a huge problem. I don't mean to be dismissive of that. We have slave labor going on right here within our borders in North America.
Oh, yeah, that's so tragic. And just another loophole in the amendment that supposedly ended slavery. There's that, and the caveat that prisoners can be coerced into doing work at literally zero money. Um, that's just what a tragedy. And this is the system we rely on for our cheap food. Supposedly the abundance that's brought about by capitalism, and yet somehow it's having to rely on slave labor conditions, which supposedly capitalism did away with. But there you have it. The contradictions once you get down to the heart of the actual matter.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So,
And that goes on to have effects on everyone else. Because if you look at our efforts to change industrial agriculture, people trying to create local alternatives to that and make a living doing regenerative agriculture
mhm.
have to compete with massive corporations getting big tax breaks shoveled to them for money for not even growing produce in a lot of cases, and essentially being able to pay labor at $3 an hour for a lot of agricultural work. That becomes can think of that as becoming, because of that competition, it becomes the base rate of labor costs for most agricultural work is kind of set by the feds at $3 an hour. So if you're trying to start a farm, you there have been a few really interesting studies. One was done by Berkeley, one was done by Michigan State University, there was one done by Vermont, and they're looking at local small scale organic farmers, and for the most part they end up making, guess what, about $3 an hour for their work, if they're making any money at all, because that's tied in, it's locked in. And when you're talking about doing weeding and picking vegetables, the feds have made the base rate for doing that work $3 an hour. So you have to be really smart, really clever, and use really good design if you want to make a living creating alternatives to that system. And that's hardwired into our law.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not to mention all the other sort of financial shenanigans they can pull. Like, if they don't like a competitor, they can just price dump a lot of product into their region and drive the prices so low that they can outlast their competitor. Same sort of thing that Walmart likes to do when they drive down prices in a town they move into long enough to starve out the competition and then raise them back up. It's it's supposedly, again, it's supposedly against what our capitalist form is supposed to be. We're supposed to be all about competition and just the triumph of ideas and people that are just better business people. But when it comes to the rubber hitting the road, it almost never seems to work out that way. And obviously, tragically, agriculture is no exception to that.
Yeah, as Noam Chomsky said, and I might screw up the quote a little bit, our system isn't really capitalism. It's privatization of profits and socialization of risk.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's socialism for the wealthy and capitalism for everybody else. It's Darwinian capitalism for
Right.
everybody.
Absolutely. And I argue with people all the time who think this is the best thing that we can ever expect. in the world. It's just like, look at just a little bit of it. See for yourself. It's not, this is not shadowy conspiracies. This is not, a secret group controlling everything. This is out in the open. This is just the way the system works. All you have to do is get a little bit past the rhetoric that they try to throw at you to say that we live in a meritocracy, or it's, just survival of the best ideas and all these things. Just push past those fluffy little narratives, and you'll see for yourself. It's just not so. That's just not what we have. Um, and
Yeah, people say it's like, oh well, this is the market. It's what the market gave us. No, we got history books. We got people actually sitting around. In a lot of cases, they were literally sitting around, probably a smoke-filled room, and just some guys who happen to have money and power said, I think this is the way things should be from now on. And of
sure.
course, it benefited them, so they all nodded their heads. And 1,000 years later, it's still that way. But it doesn't have to be.
No, it doesn't have to be. But yeah, I mean, that really is how hierarchies get maintained, wherever you find them. It's just someone gets an advantage. They're like, hey, I kind of like it like this. I better hope that no one else can get this same advantage. And I certainly don't want my children or my friends to slip back. So I'm going to do whatever I can to slam the door in everyone else's face so that I can keep milking that cash cow.
Yeah, and it's such a funny perspective when we look at it compared a healthy society anywhere else in the world. I'm gonna flub or not be able to remember the anthropologist's name, but there was an anthropologist who did a study who went around to different traditional societies around the world in small village models, and asked people in their villages to a very weird question to people in such a situation, to rank the people in their communities, in their village, by how rich and how poor they were, by how wealthy they were.
Mm-hmm.
And those kinds of words, rank people by how wealthy they were, or whatever the word in their language was for that idea of being wealthy as a person. And literally every single time, every place in the world that he went to ask this question, people spontaneously ranked the person in their communities, or people in their communities, with the greatest financial wealth right at the bottom of the scale, along with people who were like terminally ill and had disabilities that kept them in very bad life circumstances. They always put those people who were the richest with financial capital wealth in their communities right at the bottom of the scale. Every language in the world has a word like our English word miser, which is someone who is rich in financial capital to the exclusion of everything else that matters in life. Because when you start seeking out that accumulation of that advantage of financial capital in that way, you automatically close yourself off to relationships with the neighbors and the rest of the people around you. Unlike the trees we were talking about being the original socialists, you create a community where there are people who are in circumstances where they have to turn to crime, where they have to turn to desperate measures in order to maintain themselves. You create a community that doesn't have beauty in it. You create a community that has, where you have to look at people who are in poverty. You create an ugly way of life for yourself. That path takes us to true poverty. And yet, we're so confused, we put it on magazine covers and celebrate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think for those people that have hoarded so much for themselves, I think at some level they have to know that they're doing it at the expense of everyone else. And that at some level, all of the tales that they tell themselves about how they deserve when everyone doesn't, and this is just how the world works, and so on and so forth, I think those are damaging to their emotional and psychological well-being. So I think there's a lot of truth in that tale of the miser that you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can look at industrial agriculture. Look at the lie that we have to tell ourselves to tolerate looking at industrial agriculture, looking at chickens in warehouses in cages, stacked on cages, stacked on cages. We have to devitalize those chickens or pigs in order to do that. We have to see
Yeah.
them almost the same as
Yeah.
furniture. But if you can remove that, then we live in a world that is populated with creatures that are more magical than anything in Harry Potter. If you can really see that chicken, that Malay jungle fowl is a miraculous beast. Yet we turn it into something that we can eat like nuggets. And if you're the kind of person that can turn another human being into something that you can tolerate, seeing live in poverty,
Yeah.
in a different community from yourself, you have shut yourself off to 99% of the beauty and magic that exists in this world that we inhabit. That that is true poverty to me. I have great sympathy for someone who has done that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well put.
And so, to save them from that, we really need to seize their assets and distribute them.
Well, I mean, that definitely wouldn't hurt. But I think also, truly, we need to be promoting empathy for everybody, and rehumanizing the dehumanized, putting faces and stories on all these people that you can so easily flip through a magazine or a online article and feel bad for a second, but not really uh, have to put too much into emotional effort into. I think empathy is the key, very much so.
Yeah, to clarify my moment of dark gallows humor there, I agree 100%. The real leverage point here is to fix the spiritual problem that we've created in our society, and that requires us to have empathy for the people who are in that situation. So yeah, I thank you for calling me back to empathy after.
No, no. I mean, I definitely I can understand the desire to just bring the whole thing crashing down and start fresh. Because it in many ways it seems like it's you know it's a system that's just too powerful to be defeated. It seems. Uh, you look at all of its power and might to literally reshape the world, reshape people's lives, decide who wins and loses, all of these things. It seems beyond. And I think as long as we just see ourselves as individuals only, then it is beyond anyone's capability. It's not like any of these billionaires even got to their spots by themselves. So why should we think that any one person could ever do anything to bring them down? It took collective action to get them there. It's going to take collective action to bring them back down to earth. And considering the number of space flights that billionaires have been taking lately, that's a literal truth, or literal. I mean that literally. That it'll take collective action to bring them back down to earth. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and the one thing that I could say that is hopeful to me is this whole system is so utterly unsustainable that we've created, and we have kind of this like idea in the way sustainability has been sold. When we say something is unsustainable, it sounds like it's bad for dolphins and monarch butterflies, but no,
right.
it means it literally cannot be sustained into the future.
Right.
This system is, I look around, it looks like it's in full collapse to me, and only something better can come from it. We're going to build this new world that we're talking about in the rubble of billionaire spaceships.
I agree. I agree. But we have to be there, and we have to be ready if and when that time comes to seize the moment and push for that better future. Otherwise, it's going to be the fear mongers and the doomsayers and the divisionists that are going to sway people's minds. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so another question that Jimmy would very much like me to ask you is about your book, and I don't think I was even aware that you were writing a book. So please tell the listeners about that.
It talks about a lot of the topics we've been talking about tonight, especially about this. It's called Beauty in Abundance, and it's about exactly this topic: how we can create viral change by cultivating this image, this vision of beauty, and doing it in our own landscape or landscapes or our own community landscapes. So it's definitely patterns and projects and designs that that people can use to do this kind of thing that we've been talking about, with a mind to doing it in a way that is also spiritually satisfying for us and meets these needs that we have for creativity and expression and beauty as well. So my thought is that this has largely been lacking even in the permaculture literature. We have a lot of books on beautiful gardening, and even some books on beautiful ecological gardening, but nothing that I've seen on patterns for beauty in 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 productive ecological landscapes like we've been talking about. So it's about 400 pages, and it's largely patterns. It's over 100 patterns and designs and projects that people can use. And you know what? I think it's the only gardening book on how to make a pretty garden that's ever been created that has a chapter on the Black Panthers.
Well, that is definitely something you can hang your hat on.
Yeah, which, like I said when I started here, I don't know why that's the case, because I don't know how you can talk about having a pretty
Yeah.
garden and not talk about this sort of thing, because otherwise you end up creating. Because can a garden that isn't socially just and sustainable really be beautiful?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Right.
By the way, do you have a link to that book anywhere? I'm having trouble finding it. Just
No,
searching.
it's just today was released for pre-sale
Oh.
for the ebook version. There's going to be print versions as well. If you're into ebooks, you can order that now. You're at the website here. If you scroll down, if you go back to the main page,
Okay.
the website here, and so yeah, click on transform. Oh no, click on
Nope.
the
Just
transformers
the Transforming Adventures.
right there. That'll get you there.
Okay.
And then I think, yeah, so scroll down, and I think I have a couple of posts pinned at the top here. And the third one there is "Thank You Midwest Permaculture Convergence Slideshow." I've only been sharing the the links for this book privately so far. I have a marketing campaign set, and one of the reasons why is the book is going to be entirely grassroots. It's made for grassroots organizers and people trying to spread this kind of thing in their own community, to communicate this idea that we can create these abundant and ecological landscapes in ways that are beautiful. So yeah, so this says order now on there. This takes you to the link where you can buy pre-order the book. It's going to be out in November 24th. And one of the things where I would ask anyone who's listening to kind of consider helping me out with this, joining and being a grassroots distributor of this book and helping get the word out about it, because I am boycotting Amazon with it, which I'm told is suicide for books. And
Good for you.
publishing this book, they were like, you can't do that. You can't Amazon boycott or boycott Amazon. So it was like, well, then I'm just going to do this by myself. I've hired some people to help make this a really great book. I'm hoping to really raise the level of what a really good quality book is within our community. So everything is cited really well. I think it's a great quality book that's been contributed to by a lot of people in the movement. And it's not going to be on Amazon. I'm
Excellent.
not sending another guy to space off of a permaculture book.
Oh yeah, yeah. Good for you though. I really wish you luck on that. I hope it does well. Um, I see you have a thistle front and center as one of the flowers on your cover. I really like that because I've always thought thistles were incredibly beautiful, despite that people hate them so much. As
And this one actually is the thistle relative, the thistle that is cardoon, so that's an artichoke too. So that's actually a
Oh,
high quality edible ornamental thistle. And it's a
wow.
beautiful flower, but some people who hate their weeds will see this thing and they will see a 6 foot tall thistle with massive flowers on it, and it's like the worst nightmare, which I kind of love about
Ah, just got to take a change in the way you frame the world. Definitely so. I remember I used to hate, I'm guessing you have Creeping Charlie out where you're at too. You may call it by a different name. Um, I used to hate Creeping Charlie because it's such an invasive species. It overtakes lawn. It'll outcompete almost any ground cover. Um, but then I really got to thinking about it, and it has flowers. It doesn't need fertilizer or watering. When you do need to cut it, because it's very low and slow growing, but when you do need to cut it, it leaves a very fresh scent because it's a member of the mint family, and that's really all it took to just completely turn my mind around on that one. But it's still listed as a noxious weed in Minnesota, everywhere in Minnesota.
it. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of these things too, even if they're not optimal for our ecosystems, instead of thinking that we have to go to war with them, our whole mindset about nature is a war mindset. And that's not a surprise at all, since these companies actually were war companies. They started
For
out
sure.
making chemical weapons, and then the war ended, and they had to find a new market for their products because they couldn't justify spraying them on humans anymore. And so they decided, to figure out how to create a market for spraying them on plants more and to sell that. And so we have a whole war mindset about this whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true.
So instead, we could look at it. I never try to solve a problem with a weed of any kind by removing the weed. I solve all those problems by increasing biodiversity. Because
Absolutely.
if you try to solve a weed problem by removing the weed, then you have permanently worked weeding into that system because you're just recreating the niche that the weed moved into in the first place. You will every year forever on be fighting against that weed. But if we can solve the problem by thinking about adding biodiversity and adding things to compete with it and adding things that will be more productive and turn that into a diverse, abundant ecosystem without trying to fight that weed, then we have solved that weed problem like a Jedi with our minds.
Mm-hmm.
Then
Yeah.
never have to come back and weed it again.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, I look at weeding as a means to get rid of weeds, very similar to the way that people think that the police can get rid of crime. In that you're getting rid of the problem, you're taking it off the street and whatnot, but what they never consider is that they're never changing the underlying conditions. They're never asking, why is this person a criminal? Just as they never ask, why is this weed present in my community of plants? And if you get that answer, then you can stand a chance of alleviating whatever it is that's bothering you.
It's so funny because I have used that. I've never used that metaphor that way. I've always used it exactly the opposite way. So after I teach, this is how permaculture becomes very subversive because after I teach people that we can take this approach to weeding and they see it and it works, then you can say, you know what? We should see all biodiversity that way, including the human biodiversity. And we should not see people as weeds to be plucked out of systems and thrown into the garbage someplace. We should see them for their potential and for what they can contribute and how we can support them and turn them into productive assets in society instead of treating them like weeds. So it's funny. I love that you reversed my metaphor that I've never used it the way you use it. I've been using
Yeah.
it the opposite way.
Very good. Very good. All right. um, okay.
And
So,
now on, I'm going to use it the way you just did too.
oh, I
Well,
appreciate that. I'm flattered. I'm flattered. Um, so one final question from Jimmy, and you definitely don't have to acquiesce to this, but he would like very much for you to sing a song because he says you have a wonderful voice.
Well, after talking for a while, my voice tends to get a little bit squeaky, but I will sing Deep River, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground.
Oh, that was beautiful, man. Thank you so much for indulging us with that. That was just wonderful. That's the cherry on top of this whole discussion tonight. So thank you very much for that.
Cool, yes.
I feel like talking with you tonight has just been a masterclass in permaculture. I feel like it's even next level stuff. My mind is just firing on all cylinders now. So thank you so
Well,
much for being so generous with your time tonight. Um, yeah. So I'll just ask: is there any other parting words or advice that you'd like to give the audience before we call it a night in what is hopefully the first of many collaborations together?
I hope so too. I'd love to come back and chat some more with you on these topics.
Wonderful.
Only that, do the thing and whatever level you can. And we're looking at this page here, beauty in abundance. Come back to that idea of we have the right to figure out what will make our own lives and our own situation, our families, beautiful and abundant for ourselves, understanding that that we that becomes the vision that we can communicate to other people and help other people do the same. And so I would just ask, if you're listening to this, think about what that means. What does a beautiful life mean to you? It doesn't mean the things that these billionaires think it does, right? So what does that mean? And how can you work and do that work of achieving that beautiful life for yourself, and understanding that, like the trees in the forest, that means creating a beautiful community for ourselves. So this permaculture work is always one step and the other. We're always creating a beautiful life and a beautiful world together. And what a beautiful path for activism that is.
Oh, ah, beautifully said. Thank you so much for that. I can't think of a better way to end this. So I think we should go out on the highest note possible and call it a night for tonight. So thank you so much again for being so generous with your time and being both entertaining and incredibly informative tonight. And until next time,
Thank you so much.
thank you. Have a great night.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Whew. Wow. I need a second just to come down from that. That was quite the ride. I'd have to, you know, I'd have to put that in at least the top 5 episodes that I think I've ever done so far. That was really great to have Mike along for the ride with that. So that was Mike Hoag. You can check out his book by going to his Transformative Adventures website and see all the other really cool, groovy things he's got going on. I hope you learned something tonight, and definitely, I don't know if you've seen the queue, but oh no, that's Andrew Milson. Whoops, wrong one. So we are only on video 38 of 64, so there's going to be plenty more in this series to come, and I'm really gonna to try my best to incorporate even more permaculture voices as we go along, and definitely have Mike back again to help with all this. So thank you all for watching tonight. I really appreciate you coming along. Thank you especially to Jimmy Leaf Tender. Your questions were great. Your commentary kept me smiling and cracking up as we were going along. So thank you so much. I hope you all join me this upcoming Friday as we continue along with part 2 in State and Revolution. Every Friday night, I do a theory stream. So we are on the communist side. I alternate back and forth between communist and anarchist thinking for every Friday night. And I tried doing a read aloud where I actually read the text and responded to questions and commented on it myself, and it wore my voice out too much. It was too hard to do. So I'm not quite at the level to do that yet. So we're going to continue on this upcoming Friday with more audiobook recording of I don't know if it's chapter, I don't know which chapter we're in actually, because the chapters weren't numbered, strangely enough. But we'll continue on with State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin this upcoming Friday at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, and then from there we'll just keep doing the permaculture stuff every Sunday until we run out of this playlist, and then we'll move on to something else. I always like to mix it up a little bit. So if any of you listening to would ever like to be in the call-in guest for the night, I'm always looking for more voices to help me out with this show. It definitely helps to have more people to bounce ideas off and to give their input. I always enjoy what I learn from other people's perspectives. No matter how much you know or think you know or are new to the material we cover, it's always appreciated and always beneficial to the conversation. So, having come to that conclusion, we are going to raid out into another person. So thank you very much again, guys, for sticking with me tonight. Lectam, and until we meet again this upcoming Friday, I hope to see you there.